A few years ago, a young American man took 3 hits of ecstasy and then used a hammer to beat his parents to death. After that, he announced on Facebook that he was having a party. The guy then got busy cleaning up the blood and hiding his parents' bodies. 60 of his friends soon turned up to play beer pong and smoke cigars. Little did they know they were partying with a murderer. It was an unforgivable crime. It was a heinous crime. And that's why in the past, possibly the most unbelievable kind of punishment was reserved for this special kind of killer. Before we get to this most horrendous of punishments, let's talk a little bit about the act itself. That is the act of killing one's parents. The name for it is parricide. When a son or daughter kills the father, it's called patricide, and when it's the mother that's murdered, it's called matricide. It could also mean the killing of a close relative, so siblicide, the murder of a sibling, could fall under that umbrella. As could avunculicide, which means taking out your own uncle. A 3rd century Roman lawyer named Modestinus first laid down the law regarding this crime, and he said it covers first cousins or even someone who isn't related by blood, but financially supports another person. You might not be surprised to hear that if you killed your parents a few hundred years ago in Europe, the outcome wasn't good, especially if your parents were of so-called noble blood. In Italy in the 16th century, Beatrice Cenci did that to her father, a powerful count who was a monster to his children. After suffering at the hands of her vile pop for many years, with the help of her siblings and stepmom, Beatrice took her father out by bludgeoning him to death and throwing his body off a balcony. You have to remember, this was an awful man. He'd already been imprisoned for incest, but he managed to get out early due to the fact that he was wealthy and could grease the right palms. Beatrice and co. tried to make it look like suicide, but the papal police were suspicious. Her lover was horrifically tortured but died without snitching. Others were soon charged with being co-conspirators to the murder, and they were sentenced to death. The people of Rome protested about this because they knew what the horrible father had done to his kids. The Pope wouldn't budge an inch, for the reason that he didn't want parricide to become widespread. There had been other recent cases of kids killing parents, so he had to make an example of Beatrice and her brothers and stepmom. And that he did, in the most brutal fashion. Her elder brother was tortured in a public square for everyone to see. After that, his head was smashed with a mallet. The spectators saw what might happen to them if they ever got any ideas about killing a parent. The brother was then torn apart limb from limb. Beatrice and her stepmom got off lucky with a relatively gentle beheading, while the youngest of the brothers, only aged 12, was spared. His punishment was watching his family die and then doing a short stint as a galley slave. We included that last bleak tale because we want to hammer home to you just how serious parricide was taken. It wasn't just a matter of how could they do that to their own flesh and blood. The powers that be at the time didn't want kids thinking they could whack a parent and get the riches and power they thought they deserved. This is why the worst kind of punishment was sometimes meted out to children that committed this crime. The establishment were the powerful, so it's not surprising that they created strict laws that might prevent them from being killed by their own offspring. The crime was also seen as the most unnatural crime a person could do, so it warranted the most unnatural kind of execution. That execution in the early days was called Poena cullei. It can be translated as penalty of the sack. It's thought it goes back as far as the 1st century BC, but there were some modern cases too. We'll get around to those later. Let's start with ancient Rome and the first cases of the penalty of the sack. It was no doubt a cruel and unusual punishment, with the emphasis being on unusual. One of the earliest known cases can be found in an ancient book called History from the Foundation of the City. In it, the historian Titus Livius, aka Livy, wrote this: Publicius Malleolus, who had killed his mother, was the first to be sewn into a sack and thrown into the sea. It said this guy was first fitted with heavy wooden shoes and a wolf's hide was placed over his head. In this case, the leather hide is presumed to be the sack. That doesn't sound too unusual for the Romans, and not all that cruel, but things get a lot worse. There were a few iterations of getting the sack, with most cases being for the crime of parricide. Even though people might have been executed by being thrown to wild beasts or burned or crucified, it seemed the Romans thought the sack was about as bad as you could get. In the 1st century AD, one historian wrote that Emperor Augustus was reluctant to hand down this form of the death penalty, and that was before the sack turned into something much more gruesome. Emperor Claudius, who came a few decades later, was okay with the sack. The Stoic philosopher named Seneca the Younger said this about him: The Emperor Claudius sewed more men into the culleus in 5 years than history says were sewn up in all previous centuries. We saw more cullei than crucifixions. You might now be thinking, surely, being drowned in a sack is much better than being crucified or burned. Why on earth did those Romans fear the sack so much? It seems the answer is they feared very much falling to the bottom of the ocean or whatever body of water they were thrown into. It was also very undignifying, or at least that's what the Romans thought. But there was something else too. Seneca the Younger had a father, who you can guess was named Seneca the Elder. It's he who first mentioned someone getting the sack, but having a guest put in there with him. This gives the punishment a whole new meaning. He wrote that one or more snakes joined the man in the sack. Just imagine that, being sewn into a sack with a bunch of snakes. But it gets even worse than that. The poet Juvenal talks about a monkey being put into the sack. That kind of adds a comedic element to getting sacked, at least if the monkey wasn't big enough to gouge out a person's eyes. Being stuck in a drowning sack with a terrified monkey, however, is far from funny, as these incredibly strong animals are known to tear limbs off people who get too close. We have to go to the 3rd century for things to get even wilder. The Roman jurist we just mentioned, named Modestinus, wrote about the punishment of Poena cullei for the crime of parricide. We'll let you hear this part in his own words, or at least in his words in translation. Here's what he said according to a law book called the Digest that was written after he died. According to the custom of our ancestors, the punishment instituted for parricide was as follows. A parricide is flogged with blood-colored rods, then sewn up in a sack with a dog, a dunghill cock, a viper, and a monkey. Then the sack is thrown into the depths of the sea. This is the procedure if the sea is close at hand, otherwise he's thrown to the beasts. Okay, so now you have to imagine the scene. Try to think about how you'd handle this. You're whipped and so are covered in welts and your own blood. You're then forced into a sack with a viper, a venomous snake that will no doubt bite you. You won't die instantly, of course, but it's probably not the best day you've had in your life. To make things worse, a monkey's thrown into the mix. What kind of monkey is a matter of importance. One of those small cute ones or a really angry baboon with huge fangs. Or were the Romans referring to a large ape, animals that could do serious damage to you on your way to the water? In fact, in the modern academic paper The Ape in Roman Literature, apes are mentioned in relation to the punishment of parricides. Then, just for good measure, a cock and a dog is thrown into the sack, which likely wouldn't bother you in the slightest since you'd be busy being bit by a highly venomous snake and trying to stop an ape from taking off your face. The drowning part can only be a blessing. Some scholars think in the 3rd century the practice started to die out and much more humane punishments such as being thrown to wild animals or simply being burned to death completely replaced the sack. It didn't stay unpopular for long because in the 4th century Emperor Constantine initiated a revival of Poena cullei. It's written that he said parricide should get a similar treatment, although he adds something quite interesting to the story. He said that the guilty person should be sewn up in a sack and in this dismal prison have serpents as his companions. At some point, the person was thrown into the sea, but the question is, how long would that person have stayed in the sack prior to being taken to the water? That's an important question, and there is no definitive answer. A few minutes sharing a sack with snakes, or possibly with a great ape, a dog, and a cock, could almost be bearable, but a few hours, days, that would be tough going. How long in that dismal prison did the condemned have to stay? If it was longer than an hour, a fight with a bear would have been a much better way to die. There are other Roman texts too which describe the law. In the 6th century, Emperor Justinian talked about getting the sack. In the law book Corpus Juris Civilis, it's written that those guilty of parricide should be sewn up in a sack with a dog, a cock, a viper, and an ape. Okay, so this time we do get an ape. Historians to this day argue about translations, as well as when the punishments happened, and if they happened as they were written about. It seems everyone agrees that the practice died out with the rise of the Byzantine Empire, a time when killing your family mostly resulted in being thrown into the flames. We've not finished yet, though, viewers. There is a sequel. Let's call it Poena cullei II, After Rome. A man named Johann von Buch said it was around 14th century Germany, and again, it was a dreaded punishment reserved only for the terrible act of parricide. It was, however, a rather tame affair in Germany. No cock or ape was hurt in the execution, and instead of a serpent, a picture of a serpent sufficed. Even if a dog or a cat, hardly anything to worry about for the accused, was thrown into the animal cocktail, they might have their own compartments in the sack. There's also another matter. The Romans often used a leather sack, which was almost watertight, so that person would not drown quickly. The Germans used linen, which would allow water in very fast. There was one recorded case in Germany in 1548 when a man was thrown into a river inside a sack. The linen sack had been coated with something to make it more watertight, but when it hit the water, part of it split. By all accounts, the man died, but the dog and the cat that had been sharing his death sack swam away to their freedom. The last cases we can find happened in the 18th century in Germany. In one case, a sheep was put into the sack, which must have been much better than an angry ape. In another case, a serpent joined the condemned man, but it was a non-venomous, if not large, colubrid snake. If you think that's the worst punishment you've ever heard about, watch this. Walled up alive, worst punishment in the history of mankind. Or maybe you think this is worse. The blood eagle, worst punishments in the history of mankind.